It's time to shine some light beneath the well. You wouldn't think so, but the wiki actually qualifies this as a mini-dungeon, probably because it technically has a dungeon item and mini-boss in it. It's mostly fetching stuff for mummies whose biggest regret is apparently not owning some of these fabulous products only available in the Clocktown store, whose owner may or may not be up to illegal activities at night. I'll give it credit, there's a shortcut into Ikana Castle from the dungeon item, so you don't even have to wait afterwards to go into a proper mini-dungeon. The closest thing to a puzzle here is figuring out where the mummy's wand, but if you haven't worked out by now what sprouts leaves when watered, then it's impressive you even made it this far. Give the controller back to your brother. All joking aside, it's original, but originality isn't always good. Even the big pose, basically just the pose from Ocarina's Forest Temple, but now it's bigger. It's time to face the creepy crawlies in Swamp Spider House. While this is more like a collection quest, it's listed as a mini-dungeon, and it's not like Majora's Mask has mini-dungeons, so I feel it's fair game. What it may lack in bosses and items, it makes up for in its non-linearity and variety of puzzles, like having to put bugs into dirt mounds and waking up a sleeping scrub. Perhaps the most interesting is a tree room with Skulltulas wandering in the grass, and slamming the tree releases several of them. The crawling noises also help to narrow down where they are, but that doesn't mean it's effortless figuring out where they are without a guide. All things considered, I think it's a good mini-dungeon with a decent prize of the Mask of Truth to cheat in dog races and get Gossip Stone advice. It's time to swim among arachnids in Oceanside Spider House. Yep, it's another seek and exterminate affair, this time with the addition of a timer if you want to get the Giant's Wallet, and I guess you do. Jars, boxes, behind bookshelves, chandeliers, there's such an infestation that you find several of them before you even enter the front door. As if the spider problem wasn't enough, it's also full of the living dead who actually help you get a piece of heart if you convince them that the child wearing a skull mask is somehow actually their multi-story tall leader. And of course Skull Kid couldn't let you forget about him because he's plastered his face everywhere, time for some remodeling. Really, it has everything you need, from things to set on fire to things to smash and knock over. What more could you ask for? It's time to go with the flow in Great Bay Temple. Someone better call Mario, because this temple has got one major pipe flowing problem. Some of them have somehow frozen over. Funny thing is the two fixes in the 3DS version of Ocarina's Water Temple were here first, namely C-button swap swimming item and marking where you need to go with the pipes that aren't flowing. Now the temple has a couple of neat references, like how Wart's a reference to Link to the Past Argy, and how Gyorg is clearly a reference to Jaws, because you're going to need a bigger boat. Or platform. The gecko, however, is one of the most annoying enemies ever, and he can icy hot back to the swamp. For the most part, it's better than Ocarina's Water Temple, but it's still a water temple, so my opinion of it's more than a little waterlogged. It's time to go mask hunting inside the moon. The best way to describe it is it's kind of like Ganon's Tower. If it was 4 barriers and they were completely optional, you also have to have collected every mask to get the most out of them. Other than the Zora one relying on blind luck, the others are pretty alright, with the Deku and Goron ones testing movement abilities and the regular Link one a gauntlet and also bomb cheer use. Majora himself is actually a pretty compelling boss, where each form requires some tactic you've learned throughout the game in order to overcome him. Or you can get the fierce deity Link and casually nuke him, but I suggest trying the normal way first. All in all, pretty good, even if the comparison to Ganon's Tower isn't exactly the most favorable. My boy Majora's really carrying this one, which honestly isn't hard because he was already pulling the moon down. It's time to grab some grog for Pirates' Fortress. This is sort of like a spin on Gerudo Valley from Ocarina, having no boss but mini-bosses and technically a dungeon item in the form of a hookshot. It starts out with a bit of a puzzle getting into the main fortress before you have to go stealth, at least unless you grab the stone mask, in which case it's mostly easy sailing. Only the elite guard really sees through it, so you can't get around having to fight them. Their leader technically does too, but a convenient wasp nest makes really short work of them. My main complaint is the same as Ocarina's Ice Cavern, requiring repeat trips for the eggs if you don't have at least 4 bottles to keep them in, but at least you can get 6 in this game. Despite this and it technically lacking a proper boss, I like the amount of content and am definitely very favorable towards the aesthetic, though I know that's bias on my part. It's time to be a knight in ancient castle of Ikana. Now this is a mini-dungeon with a dungeon item in the form of a song, 2 mini-bosses, even if one is a repeat, a boss, and a few mild puzzles, one of which requires outside purchase at your local Goron. Probably the funniest thing is messing with them. The 2 soldiers will dance to the Bremen dance, and the king will react to you wearing Kita's mask, being the first to actually question the child's small size. My only real complaint is it's incredibly linear. Ocarina's bottom of the well, this is not, but at least it's also not Majora's beneath the well, so I'll count my blessings in this case. On another funny note, the Re-Deads dance if you wear the Kita mask, which makes them easy to kill, or, just leave them be because they're not hurting anyone. Yet. It's still a mini dungeon, so there's not a lot to it, but it's probably the second best one so far, and certainly the best one in Majora's Mask for sure. It's time to rock and roll into Snowhead Temple. Well, one thing's for sure, this really ratchets things up compared to Woodfall, centering around a massive tower and relying on precision rolls getting up it. While the mini-boss is technically repeated, the second encounter is significantly harder to catch up to even with the bunny hood without just sniping him with fire arrows. The boss can be incredibly easy if you sit there and shoot him with fire arrows, or surprisingly exciting if you go the Goron chase route, which I'd recommend. While the dungeon can be unforgiving with the potential falls, at least the angled rolls have safety nets, so there's some mercy. With some Deku Flowers, I'd say it effectively makes use of all Link's main moves and serves as a good escalation dungeon. It's time to descend into the trees in Woodfall Temple. Being the first dungeon, it isn't too complicated, but it does make pretty good use of both Deku and normal Link, the hardest being moving Deku Flower platforms like in the Deku Palace. While it's mostly a straightforward dungeon, 2 optional rooms exist with the map and compass, and the stray fairies of course provide their own out-of-the-way exploration for the initiated. The boss himself is also pretty simple, at least in the N64 version. Pretty much look for an opportunity to hit him with sword and occasionally navigate bugs. The mini-boss was arguably more complicated since you have to Deku Flower the turtle and then still get the fleeing frog with bow and arrow as he's running around the ceiling. Majora's Mask doesn't have as many dungeons, so this sort of feels like the Deku Tree and Forest Temple rolled into one, having blocks and Deku Stick puzzles, but then also the bow and arrow. It does what it needs to as the first dungeon, not being too hard and having a decent enough variety of mechanics, ensuring you need a good grasp on your items if you want to get everything. It's time to set our expectations gigantically high in Stone Temple. Boy, is this temple loaded with the good stuff, featuring 4 different mini-bosses, 2 dungeon items expected use of all 4 forms, and to top it off, 1 massive scaled boss fight between titans. It even makes efficient use of space by having you flip the temple over halfway through, reusing the same environments, but now the skylights are voids into the nothingness. Probably the most difficult part was navigating these mirrors here. You have to flash them with the creepy face on your shield while the embodiments of pure darkness is trying to gnaw you. Not the best time. Batman's Scythe can also be a handful if you haven't worked out how to use the shield, mostly a problem for grumpy gamers, especially Raptors with an ego problem, but generally not too hard to deal with. What I'm saying is this temple's great. It really feels like the culmination of all your skills and is probably gonna beat the living crap out of you if your League gaming skills aren't quite poggers. It's time to overview this carnival. I think it's no surprise that I absolutely love Majora's Mask. The 3DS version was a little disappointing and you can see my review on that, but the N64 original is phenomenal. Despite having far fewer main dungeons than Ocarina of Time, they really made the most out of their short development time with great mini-dungeons, side quests, and a very compelling original story. Ancient Castle of Ikana was definitely a highlight. I could easily see it passing for a genuine dungeon with some more areas and maybe another mini-boss to get the boss key from. Personally, I even prefer Majora's Mask to Ocarina of Time overall, even though I respect Ocarina for being the one to bring the series into 3D. If you haven't played it, you owe it to yourself to try this beautiful masterpiece, preferably the original version. There are many ways you can play it, but Switch Online is the legitimate one.